And can you share an important story or a good story when you start um, working with liberated structure?
I mean, for me, the very first time I used liberating structures, I just started a job out of grad school at this health foundation. And the person who ran the health foundation had known Keith like 10 or 15 years prior. And he said, oh, you have this like big conference to put on. It was like 400 or 500 people I had to put on a conference for related to health policy. And Greg, who was the person I was working for, said, you know, you should talk to this old friend of mine, Keith. And so I set up a meeting with Keith, and Keith came into the appointment, and first things he said to me were like, I don't believe in conferences. I think they're a waste of time. I'm not coming to yours. And I was like, well, cool, that's great, but I still have to do this thing. And he was like, well, okay, like if you have to do this thing, here's this idea called Wicked Questions that he and Henry had been working on developing. And this was before I think they really published the book, or right around the time that they were getting ready to publish the book. And so because I was completely naive and had no clue about anything, I decided to make this whole 3-day conference about using Wicked Questions to talk about the future of health and healthcare in Washington State. And sillily, basically I said, for 3 days, that's all we're going to do. We're not going to try and come up with answers or solutions or policies. We're just going to try and generate better Wicked Questions about the future of health and healthcare. And at the end of it, all the feedback was like people sort of anecdotally coming up and saying like, I really don't have a clue what we just did. Like, I have no idea what that was about. But it was interesting and I was engaged. And so like the anecdotal feedback was pretty helpful. But for me, the reason that it really got my attention was following that, the Health Foundation basically took these Wicked Questions, and responding to them became part of our strategy for the next 3 to 5 years. Like answering or responding to these Wicked Questions was what shaped and guided our strategy. And so that was both kind of the helpful kind of sensation of it, which was people coming up and saying like, this was engaging, that was pretty stimulating. I don't really know. I was like confused, but I don't really like, it was interesting, but I'm confused. And the actual result for the Health Foundation, unintentionally, it wasn't part of why we did the conference, but it ended up shaping a good part of our strategy for the coming years. And so that was pretty compelling to see both the result and the sensation being pretty positive. And I remember telling Keith the story afterwards, and he was just kind of like, you are out of control. Like, I thought you were going to do Wicked Questions for like an hour. You must have like driven people totally mad doing that for 3 straight days, especially policy people. And so it was pretty funny to see his response to me when I told him what we ended up doing. I was like, well, you didn't give me any more guidance. Come on. What do you expect me to do? Like, you told me I should do this thing, so we're just going to spend our time on it.
Did you know any other liberating structures by that time or not?
I didn't know any. That was like kind of the only one I knew.
Oh, the first one, and then 3 days in a row.
Just do it. Yeah, we're just going to do it a bunch of times.
So really get it.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
And have you any story about using liberating structures out of these organizational settings, or any unusual group that you could use liberating structures?
I mean, for me, I don't know if it's unusual, but I've long relied on the structures for my own personal reflective work, just at an individual level. I think one of the boldest examples that initially caught my attention in that regards was a person in Port Townsend. Her name's Judith Kate Friedman. And she had taken critical uncertainties with her partner. And they did critical uncertainties on the future of their relationship together. Mm-hmm. And they did a long form version of it. You know, normally you can do critical uncertainties in like a couple hours. But she and Danny did it over the course of a couple of weeks, where they took one scenario and they really elaborated on it, and they talked about what that future would be like. And they were pretty difficult scenarios, mostly related to money and health. You know, it's like, are we going to have enough money? Is our health going to be stable? And how would we respond as partners in those different situations? What would we need from each other? What would we be relying on? How would we support each other? What would be the actual realities of that situation for us as partners? And hearing her tell that story, for me, really opened up my individual practice with liberating structures. So now I frequently use drawing together and eco-cycle and minimum specifications and purpose to practice and a whole bunch of the methods just for my own personal individual reflection or sense making or development or internal organizing of how I think and orient, and everything from how I write is shaped by that to just how I sustain, reflection over time. So I don't know if that's unusual, but that's kind of one of the places that I always think about, where often people aren't always thinking about how the structures can be used at an individual level. They're often thinking about, these are good big group methods. These are good team methods or organization methods, but they also work really well just for an individual person.
Yeah, for coaching process as well.
Or yeah, in one-on-one as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good in one-on-one as well.
Yeah, because you just give to your client a way to investigate themselves.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's my turn.
Somebody, I don't know. Yeah.
Why do you help liberating structures spreading all over the world, and why is that important for you?
Yeah. So for me, part of what I think makes liberating structures, and this is not so much in the methods, although I actually think the methods do this as well in a very subtle way, but it's very explicit for me in the way Keith and Henry are as people, which is they are just exceptionally generous individuals. They're just generous people. They give their time, their attention, their energy, their effort to people in incredibly and remarkably available and generous ways. And I think a lot of the structures themselves have a certain inherent generosity in them. Like somebody at one point described the mathematics of troika, and I just loved troika so much, which is like it sets up the conditions for you to give more than you take. For every one consultation you receive, you're going to give two. So like there's just something I like the mathematics of, like something like troika. And so many of the other structures, I also think, like just create the conditions for a certain kind of very subtle generosity in groups of ideas or expression or relationships. And so for me, that's part of the really important, it's just important for me, I think, to help spread something that, implicitly makes for more generous interactions between people. That we don't, have to be generous. There's more resources we can be generous with in the world than just financial or tangible resources. That there's a wider range of things that we can give and get from each other. And I think a lot of the structures emphasize and make that available in very subtle, not explicit ways. And that's just important to me. So it's both to sort of, like, for me, acknowledge and, also try and contribute in the ways that Keith and Henry have been generous with me at an individual level and with the wider community. And so that for me is one of the big motivations, is just to do that. And because I believe in what they are trying, maybe imperfectly at times, to do, which I think is to create the conditions for us to work with more of each person's intelligence, more of each person's imagination, and more of each person's creativity in a way that brings that together in a generative way, and suggests that each of us has a contribution to make that is necessary to deal with the full complexity of whatever situation we're in. So for me, that's part of why it's important to to work on spreading it.
Yeah, and I can feel that too, the generosity.
Yeah, it's just like, I don't know what it is. There's just something that I think there's part of the structure does it, but it's also just part of the people who are using the structures as well.
And actually, I believe that these people who showed up, they feel this generosity and they also are attracted to it in some way.
Yeah, completely. Yeah.
And the groups get together. So in Brazil, we have a very big group now of practitioners, and I can feel the same feeling of generosity among everyone. And this is the magic, I think, and I can see on them so the same, and it's so nice to hear that too. Yeah, I have the same feeling.
Yeah, that's to me one of the key things that I don't know how to protect it, but it's one of the key things that for me is worth protecting at all costs in the network, is that sense of generosity. I think we do a pretty good job of it, but that's one of those things that's like,
work in progress.
Yeah.